Recording is in progress. So we are here to talk about title this morning, and I'm going to go ahead and pin my video, if that's okay with you. And then we are going to, I have two different examples for you of title commitments. And I know we're all in different states. I'm thinking they're probably pretty similar because a lot of these title companies are backed by the same sort of insurance companies. There might be small differences between our states, but like you can just shout out if you're like, oh, this isn't the way it is here at all. So I'm going to talk about the things that do have the same kind of look in each state. And I'm going to probably stay more away from deeds and things like that, because I don't know if those, I've had a couple of people email me and say, could you cover these things? And I said, well, that's really a Colorado thing, so I can talk separately about that another time. So my first one I wanted to share, I just want to go over it. And so that you understand, hold on, let me get it up on the screen. So that you understand what you're looking at, we can kind of go through what it is. So this first one, when you get this, whether you're on the buyer or seller side, especially the buyer side, because you need to talk to your seller about, or the buyer about the title work, when you get a title commitment, especially if you're dealing with a brand new buyer who's never owned something before, something that's good to say is, well, the first thing I need to say is you have insurance. So that's a great thing. The title company is willing to give you insurance for this property. So you always start out on a good note, right? So these usually tend to come in an email, but I always like to open it up and just look at the whole thing. So this is what ours looks like. We have 3 major title companies in our town, and I'm sure some areas you might just have 2. I know we're in also rural areas of Colorado. My office is, I have Durango, Mancos, and Silverton, but some of those areas might have really 2 title companies, unless you want to drive a long way to have your closing. So this is what the first page is going to look like when you open it up, or at least on ours. If not, it might be moved in different like, you know, this might be later in Montana, but I'm sure it's all the same kind of stuff. On this one, the first thing I want to know, and I also want to be able to talk to my buyer about, is who to call if you have a question. So you have a closing officer who is different than your person who, okay, so closing assistant and closing officer. And there's also going to be someone who is your title person. And where is it? Title examiner up here. So that's the person that is your free advice call. You want the buyer wants to know more about their title work. So before they go and spend money on attorney, it might just be a kind of question that a title examiner can answer for them. So this is the person they're going to call. If you can't answer the question, which you usually don't want to answer the question, you have them call the title examiner. And then if you have anything to do with closings, like I need a settlement statement, I need something like that. This is what the buyer's email address is. This is his mailing for closing. Could I get wiring instructions? Those kind of things are all directed at the closing officer. Someone asked me that with a deal recently, that the lender reached out to the title examiner for their closing paperwork. And I said, well, they're probably sitting next to each other. So they'll just like pick up the phone and say, hey, Leanne, this person wants you to get in touch with them. But it doesn't really matter. Just make sure that you know who you're supposed to be reaching out to. And then here, this is important to know, is that all the costs to the title work are in one place. So just because your buyer sees all these charges right here does not mean that it's all their cost, right? So for the whole title policy, the buyer and seller together, they both get the exact same title policy look, at least here they do. It's going to say all this, and then you have to pick apart what are their costs and what are the other side's costs, right? So that scares, in my area, it is traditionally and normal and customary, which is what I always tell a buyer. It's normal and customary in my area for the seller to pay for the title work, okay? And so they'll pay the owner's policy. And then if there's a loan on it, see how the loan, they're getting, the policy is for the entire cost of the property. And then the loan is only $188. It's a little bit less, right? So the title policy is cheaper, okay? So there's a loan policy and then there's an owner policy. In my area, the seller traditionally pays this part, and that, or sorry, not the policy, over here, the $1,000, and then anything having to do with a loan is on the buyer. That's just traditional. And then another thing that's super could be different traditionally in different areas is who pays for the tax certificate. There happened to be two on this property. It probably like went over two boundaries. Maybe it went over a county line or a tax line. And so it was $50. Some of these charges are not that big of a deal. And then you have these other charges that will start out. Let's say you get a title work policy and it's going to look kind of like what I'm showing you. And then you're going to get a amended title policy. So you got to go in there and see, okay, what was amended? And a lot of places will underline all the changes so you can see it when you're looking at it. But if you have these things called endorsements, that's sort of like if you own a house or a car, you're going to have endorsements that say your house is covered and we're also getting you for flood and we're also getting you for your jewelry and furs. That's one that's always on there, and extra things. So the lender might ask for extra things and those come out on an amendment, but they all show up in the same place. You just have to piece apart what's their cost and what's the buyer's cost and what's the seller's cost, but no, they're all together. And then whoopsie, an improvement survey plat is needed for this order. Just so you know, I had permission to show this title work. It has some confidential information on it, but the deal has closed. Both of the ones I'm showing you today, I did get permission from the agent to be sharing these with you today. That's why it's not blacked out or anything. But an improvement survey plat is needed for this order. Well, that costs the both parties in here $5,000 that wasn't known about. So it helps if you are listing a property to call the title company and say, are you going to need anything for this one? Are you going to need a survey? A lot of times they just need these things called improvement, what is it called? It's called an ILC, but that's an improvement location certificate. Those things don't cost very much. They're like maybe $400, maybe $600 or so. But this improvement survey plat, that means like a survey of the entire property with all the different buildings on it. So there's obviously some reason, maybe they didn't have one ever on file for this property. So this screwed up the whole deal. And yes, when you get the title work, you have it, but it wasn't written into the original contract to buy and sell who was going to pay for it because they didn't think one was needed. So a simple phone call will help save you some of this stuff. So what ended up happening is the buyer's agent wanted this. Wait, was it the buyer's agent? I can't remember. One of the agents, the one on our side, she decided to pay for it out of her proceeds, her commission, because she didn't want someone the buyer to bail on the deal, right? Because the seller said, I'm not paying for it. So she went and paid for it just to get it done. But this is where you're going to see it. It's going to tell you if you need something, okay? So then we're going down here with who is the person who's buying the property, the proposed insured. And you want to make sure as an agent, I don't care if you're on the seller side or the buyer side, you're going to look at it and make sure it was spelled right. So check your contract, check what somebody typed in. Everybody's human and they might have made a mistake. So that's one of your jobs as an agent, is to make sure this is accurate. So this one was just proposed insured. So let me see, to be issued. Alta, so it has two people on it. And then here, look at that legal description. I bet a lot of our rural areas have things like this. So whose problem is it? This is a question for you. Whose problem is it if this is incorrect? What do you think?
I'd say everyone's, but
everybody's, but mostly you, because you have insurance, right? You have E&O insurance. So if you don't check this, and maybe you told the buyer that you really should get an attorney to look at this stuff, and they decide not to, but you didn't get that in writing, and now there's something screwed up on it and they have to come back later. It's your problem. So it is a great idea. It is a great habit. This would take you 20 minutes max on a terrible looking one. To pull out, what you do is you don't look on anything that your county might have put on, for here it's called iTax. It's like a county site where it just, your assessor's office. You don't pull it off of there. You get the vesting deed, okay? So everyone has county records. If you're in a smaller area, you might have to go somewhere or get someone at the county to like scan it to you. But in most places, these things are online. You might have to pay a couple bucks to get it. But it is the deed that the seller in the deal got the property from the seller at the time, right? So it might be 20 years old, it might be a year old. But what you want to do is look at the vesting deed and you look at this and just go through it. Anybody can mistype it. It was all copied and pasted, you know that. But somebody could have made one mistake and it's going to screw something up 5 years from now. Just look at it. The two times where you might have a problem are when this is called a meets and bounds description, and you get this in very old areas like farmland kind of things where it's not township, county. We're not squares like Kansas. It's like, you got to kind of walk this way with a chain and then you kind of go this way. And the other one I have is resort areas. Unbelievable. So you have a PUD, you have like this, the county had this whole plan, and then there was this one part, and then it was recorded this year, but it was amended this year. And that's all in the legal description. Like this legal description on like a fractional condo where it's, a little lot somewhere might be really long because of the plat map that was recorded and what you're referring to. Those are the other ones. You just want to make sure it's correct. So try to pull out the vesting deed and look at that. That's one of the only things as an agent you have to check on, but make sure you look at it. Okay. So once, and this is also the same way you're talking to your buyer. So if you're going over this, you always want to go over the title commitment with the buyer, and you say, look, send it to them right away when you get it, after you've looked at it for 2 seconds, and just make sure you know it. Send it to them and say, okay, when can I sit down and go over this with you to show you how to read your title commitment? And it takes maybe 10 minutes. It's not that long of a thing, but get on Zoom or get on the phone with both of you having it up in front of you. They have to be looking at it for them to understand what you're talking about. Tell them, these are your people you can call. Don't be scared because all of the charges are everybody's charges put together. I'll tell you which ones are yours. I checked and your names are spelled correctly. I always tell them that I already checked this. I checked and the legal description is correct for what you bought. I've had it twice happen where I had a house for sale and then not the lot that they own next to it. So the seller owned both and they were only selling the house and they were going to hold on to the lot. And guess what? It was a new title examiner and they put both together. So they almost sold by accident the lot next door because that's what the title work said. So my seller caught it. Unfortunately, I was kind of a newer agent and I didn't see it before my seller saw it. So I wasn't able to like correct it or anything, but just make sure that you're checking that. So then the next step, again, this is the same thing you're going to be telling your buyers. These are all the requirements that have to happen before we have a successful closing. So if you have if you have a loan that needs to be paid off, so on this one, there was no loan to be paid off, it looks like, but if you did, it would all say this. So these top 4 sure look like they're on every single title commitment that they ever put out. Doesn't it? It looks like they're like the same ones on everyone, but the ones down here have to do with this property. So you have to have a deed that goes from one person to the other. You have to get, so the deed of trust, that has to do with the loan they're getting, right? So they're going to get $188,000. What happens if it says 188 and then you decide the 2 weeks before closing, the buyer decides that they're actually going to get a loan for 182,000? You get an amendment, you send it to the title company once it's signed, and they can, or you don't even need an amendment. What am I talking about? The lender needs to talk to the title company and they can change that. That's not like a big deal at all. If the loan amount changes, they just have to type it up differently. But again, it says you need an improvement survey plat. So make sure you read that and that there's nothing, like if you see anything about a survey, just make sure you get on it immediately because it can take so long to get your surveyors here. I don't know what it is this week, but it was 3 weeks at least, a couple of weeks ago when I knew. And then this thing, I haven't seen this in a long time. I'm guessing this means that it is a manufactured home and that they want to make sure that it was purged correctly. And then it's actually considered by the county. I don't know if this is the same in every state. You get a manufactured home means that it was brought in on an axle. It actually has it can have wheels on it. So it might be on a permanent foundation, but if you look in the crawl space, you're still going to see the metal axle on it. So when they do that, they can put it on a permanent foundation, but then there's this whole thing that has to happen with the county that's called purging. And it means when you purge it, it is a process, kind of paperwork and also like inspections, that you're making sure that that property is affixed correctly to the land and it now can't be driven away, right? So when you can't drive it away anymore, then it means the lender will lend on it because they know you're not going to drive it away and sell it, and then they have to foreclose on the property. So that's what that means. This part right here, you're not going to deal with this very often unless you sell a lot of manufactured homes. It's just saying you got to prove to us that you purged it right. Okay, any questions so far on what you're looking at?
Hey, Heather, on the legal description, if like that one that happened to you, it's not like, oh, sorry, gotcha, accidentally sold the whole thing. It's just an amendment. How is that fixed?
Oh, it was so easy. They did it twice too with the same seller. I think it fell out of
Great.
contract and they did it again. So we just threw a fit and they go, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. So they took it off the title.
Cool.
Yeah, it was easy.
Okay.
And most of these things are pretty easy to clear up, but you just got to catch it. So then Schedule B are requirements for issuance of endorsements. So the endorsements are, like I said, all those extra things like the jewelry and furs kind of thing. Like we're going to have, the lender needs you to like clarify this thing and we're going to charge you $50 to have that. It's all the extra kind of title insurance that the lender requires, which I always say, hey, if the lender needs extra title insurance, that's great because it makes sure that you're insured and that you're good. So anytime that the lender gets involved and asks for extra stuff, that is okay. So this is the part that said you can't get an ILC, you know, the cheap kind of not really a survey. You have to actually get a surveyor to go show this. And so I think that most of this had to do with this particular property. I usually don't see, yeah, I guess it's more requirements. It just didn't fit on the page one. So it says Schedule B. See, you don't have to remember what's Schedule A, what's Schedule B. You just read the thing and you say, okay, these are the requirements. These are the other thing that you have to check. So requirements, this is where something might be funny. So you guys are not attorneys. You don't play one on TV, but there might be something in here that is like a red flag. You're like, I've never seen this before. Well, you're new, so maybe you haven't seen any of this before. But let's say it says there's a big debt from the seller has to pay off. So there's some 66,000, like, okay, so there's the loan. And then there's like a lien that shows up on here. Or it's a federal tax lien, or what is it called? There's something to do, I guess it's a lien, something was recorded against them, a judgment. Judgments happen here. It'll actually say that. So this is the craziest one I ever had. We had somebody with a gambling debt and they were forging their partner's signatures. And so they get near closing, and it's funny, my agent who had this happen to him 15 years ago is in the other room. He was on the other side. So the seller's husband, the wife had a gambling debt. She didn't tell the husband that she had gotten this huge lien against the house. I'm talking like $50,000. Didn't want to tell her husband. She just kept signing all the paperwork and wouldn't let him see any of the documents until we got to closing. She kept saying, oh, I'm just signing this stuff. Don't worry about it. So he didn't see the title work. He didn't see anything. And I'll just say it's Jared Nixon. He's over there. So Jared gets to closing. And I don't know, like, I think he brought it up. And she said on the phone, oh, yeah, don't worry about it. Yeah, no, yeah, we know about this. But it meant that they like didn't get any money from the sale. Like this was not in a good time. So they get to the closing table and literally like the husband had never seen that there was this extra $50,000, $60,000 that was owed on the house because of her gambling debt. So he freaks out in the closing. They thought he was going to break the door because he starts screaming at her and he walks out of the title company and just slams the door. And Jared's just sitting there like he's a new agent and he's shaking. Oh, like it was crazy. It closed. Everything's fine. Just know, make sure you get both parties on the line if you get something crazy like that. But this is where if you are on a seller side and you see anything about a lien, a judgment, anything that needs to be clarified, you immediately call both parties, if there are two parties to the transaction, and say, did you know about this? In some areas, you can get what's called a prelim title. And when we're in a bad market and you think that someone owes a bunch of money on their home and you're not sure if they can squeak out of it without coming to closing with money, like this used to happen all the time. You call the title company and you say, hey, can I get a prelim title on this? I'm about to list it. If you're a new agent, and in some areas, they don't do that for you. I can't remember what it's called, but they don't do it. Like, I guess in a metro area, or maybe some of yours like Vail, I know, in Colorado, they do these prelim titles, but down here, they just don't. So if you have some years under you, you can always call in a favor and say, I'm kind of nervous about this one. Can you just pull it? But if you are new, I think the trick would be like, I'm worried about this one. I have this funny feeling about this one. Could you just pull a prelim title? I just want to see what they owe on the property. Okay. So if you ever get this weird feeling like something's wrong, that's probably not enough, but you can get this pull when you're listing the property so that you can see if there's be able to get out of the house, right? Right now, we don't worry about it because even if you had a gambling debt, you're probably still making mucho money on your sale. If you're on the buyer side and you see that, I would still raise the red flag with the seller side and call the other agent and say, hey, page 2, just check it out. There's some sort of weird lien. Make sure the sellers know about it because you just don't want any. What if the sellers freaked out the day before closing because their agent didn't catch it? And now they realize they're not going to get the kind of payout they wanted. And they say, well, I don't want to sell anymore. Like, just get it out of the way. Like, just tell them what's going on. Okay. So that's, I think, all I wanted to tell you about that. Now, this is where you spend your time. So as a buyer, the exceptions are where you spend the majority of your time. If you're on the listing side and you get a title commitment, you check the legal, you check that they spelled the names right, you check what has to happen before closing, make sure there's nothing funny, make sure there's no big survey that needs to be ordered because you have to do that right away. And then you ignore everything else. Who cares what the exceptions are, really? I mean, almost always there was nothing I did with the exceptions. The property is what it is. It's up to the buyer whether they want to go through with the property or not. So exceptions are those things that aren't covered. So if you own a home and your house gets ravaged by a flood, if you don't have flood insurance, that homeowner's insurance isn't going to cover you. If you own a home and you have, let's say, another thing, like maybe your pipes aren't covered, but this part is, like, oh, if it's a water leak, we're not going to cover you, but we're going to do this. The jewelry and furs, again, like there could be exceptions. And it's the same way with title, that you can have title. Yes, they will give you insurance, but it doesn't cover everything. Because, for example, if you're in a subdivision, you can't stick up a red flag and say, I know I'm supposed to have covenants, but I want to do what I want, and I choose not to be part of this subdivision. So they can't insure you for that. So it means, like, I give you insurance, but here's all the exceptions. You actually have to abide by the covenants. You actually have to abide by these easements that are on your property. And the older the property is, or the more subdivided it is, like it's a subdivision within a subdivision within a subdivision, because those exist, like resort areas especially, you're going to have a ton of exceptions. And that's okay. It just means, like, you have something downtown Durango, founded 1880s, this, like, one of the old historic properties. It's going to have a lot of stuff on the title because a lot of things have happened over the years. There was a phone line, and then there's the electric line, and then the telegraph line. Sometimes you get telegraph lines. So that's okay, but you want to piece through it. So in this particular exceptions, you have the first 7 are on every single title that they ever give out, right? So these are all the same, and it just is what it is. They're not going to give you insurance for these things unless you buy their extra coverage, which in our area you always do, which will knock out these 3, and it pays it over insures you for those things. Okay, but if you're in our neighboring county, Montezuma County, Mancos, they won't insure those at all. You better get a survey because we're not insuring you for encroachments. Like, it is what it is. So different areas, different things, but it's always good to get those first 3 things covered. Sometimes you can get those first 3 things covered if you do a special survey. And again, it's all up to your buyers what they want to do. But these 7, I always tell people, you can't do much about this. If you get the extra insurance, these 3 go away up here. But then 8 on has to do with this subdivision, this property. And those are the ones you want to really read. So this one was on a county road. It wasn't in a subdivision, but there sure was a lot of stuff that happened here. So as a buyer's agent, what I do is, I'm not an expert, right? But I want to see if there's something that doesn't look like, maybe I want to bring it to their attention and then make sure they go to an attorney. Like, do you want to make them go to an attorney, or make sure they go to an attorney? Because most people won't go to an attorney unless you're, like, really insisting on it, because it costs them a few $100. So right of way for ditches. Okay, there's no ditch on the property. So whatever, that probably has nothing. This probably is, like, very historical. See, 1910, there's no coal on the property. They're not doing anything. But oil, gas, and minerals, there are parts of our county. So what I say on mineral rights, at least in Colorado, you just never own mineral rights. It is unheard of. Maybe 1 in 100 that I've sold would have mineral rights on it. So I just tell people, somebody else owns your mineral rights. And you have to look into whether you're okay with whatever the gas rules are, because there's nothing you can do about it. There's setbacks, there's the price isn't very good right now. So the idea that they're going to drill one on your 35 acres is probably not very high, but do your research, call all the companies and make sure you're comfortable with buying this property, because there is nothing you can do about it. And either they like that or they don't like that. If it's a little house in a subdivision, they're not going to go drilling a gas well behind it, but I don't want to be the one that says, don't worry about it. That's up to them. But having to do with the oil and this kind of thing, I just say it is what it is. It was severed a long time ago and you don't own it. So either you're good with it or you're not. But having to do with water rights are super important, and you're going to have these things. You just click on it. Like, what is this? I don't know what this is. And so sometimes you're as an agent, you're like, well, there's no map, right? Has a legal description of the property, but then like, what is this? So I kind of read it. I was like, oh, it's just water, and it doesn't say any particular water rights. This is also maybe just historical. So I click on the ones that I feel like, I don't know, what is this? But usually I can get through most of it and say, oh, this looks normal. The electric line, I'm not worried about that. And then I'll find something that I go, yeah, like right of way for the county. Like, I don't care, of course. But then there's this easement. Well, what's that? If it's an easement between you and the electric company, that's fine. But what if it was an easement for the neighbor to come in and draw from your electric line, and your person wants to put in a big barn? You might want to click on it and say, okay, where is the electric line on this property? And sometimes there's a map, which makes it really easy. And then when you're going over this, like I was saying, you go over all this with your buyer. It only takes like 10 minutes. So what you do when you get to the exceptions is you say, look, there's all these exceptions. You say, look, like any insurance, there's going to be things that they don't insure over. So for this, like if you had car insurance and you're drunk and you crash your car, like you're probably not insured. There's exceptions to your insurance. If you set your house on fire, you're probably not insured for your house insurance. These are the exceptions with this property. And I tell them these first 7 are on every single title commitment, so you don't really want to think about it. Some companies actually bold the ones you have to kind of look at. The first 7 aren't bolded and the rest are, so it visually makes it easier, okay? And then if there's an additional title commitment that comes out after it's amended, you can open up the title commitment and it will underline anything they've added to the title. So, oh, it's so easy. And otherwise, if you get an amended one, you want to call the title company and say, what did you change? Like, I'm not going to read this whole thing again. But when you're going over it with the buyers, you say, look, like, just read these and make sure you're okay with it. Every single one of them has a click mark and you can look at what it says. And this is what you say. I cannot give you advice on this title work. I can show you what to look for, but what I would do if I were you, if anything is funny to you or you don't know what it means or you're concerned about it, your very first call is going to be to that person on the first page that found this stuff and drew up the title commitment, because they're free and they might be able to answer your question without you getting further advice. And it might kind of be free advice. Like, I see this on all of them around here. It'll make you feel better than like, oh, you're the only one with this weird easement around, right? So call that person, but I also have a list of attorneys. And if you end up wanting to get an attorney, please call them within the next 24 hours, because we only have X amount of time until we have a title objection deadline. And we need to get your objections in or get out of the contract if for some reason you wanted to before then. So take your time, but don't take too much time. Read through this, ask your questions of the title company really soon, and then make sure you call an attorney immediately, because it might take a few days for them to be able to meet with you. So water rights, I might have them really look at, easements, anything like that. And especially if there's no map, call the title company. It might be a meet and bound easement. So you have a regular square and that's the property, and it says, walk 34 feet this way, and they go northwest this way. And then the easement goes, and you're going, I have no idea where that is, but I've had title companies say, so it looks to me from the GIS map that it's kind of around that tree, and then it goes this way, and then it cuts down here, and you go, well, does it go before the barn or after the barn? She goes, I think it's after the barn. It kind of goes that way. So they're giving you enough information that you can make an educated decision if there's a problem or not. So any questions on that so far? Loans. Oh, go ahead. Oh, nobody. Okay, so here's some other things that have come up. I think I can stop sharing right now. Go back here. Okay, so property legal. Are the loans correct? So if you had a title commitment and you were on the seller side and it turns out that there is a mortgage that will need to be paid off before closing, ask them, was this the loan that you originally had on the property? Sometimes it's not updated, like it got sold, you bought it through Quicken Loans and then it sold to this bank and then they sold to this bank. It might only show the original loan before it was sold a few times. That's okay. But just make sure, was this the original loan you got? Let's say they go, oh, I only own 50,000. This is showing that I own 80,000. It's like, that's okay. That was the original loan you took out on this property at the time. What you want to make sure of is there's this thing called ghost loans, and we don't see them as much anymore, ghost mortgages. So foreclosure crisis, you had a ton of bad mortgages and bad foreclosures done. Like I remember being on auction.com or one of these crazy websites to have my people buy the property. And I was actually on the phone with a call center in, I can't remember if it was India or Pakistan or somewhere. So like the time zone was different, just to get somebody to sign the documents because they happened to be the company that foreclosed. Like it was awful. So you can imagine when you're dealing with these awful foreclosure type things, that there were many times that the foreclosure was done incorrectly and the old loan that foreclosed and is now gone because the bank owned the property, it was never taken off the title. So you would look at this and you'd find that there was the loan that my people actually had, but then there was this old loan from a seller that didn't even own the property anymore, still attached to the property. So that's why you just skim it. It'd take you 2 seconds to just say, oh, why are there two loans? Sometimes there's two loans because the person took out a home equity loan, right? Because then there'll be two things to pay off. But there's other times you get this weird thing. It's all fine. If something like that happens, if you have enough time, say you have 6 weeks before closing or 4 weeks before closing, and you'll catch it in the first few days because you got the title, that can be cleared up before closing. The title company has to contact the bank if they still exist and say, why is this, like, didn't this get foreclosed? It should be taken off the title. It just takes a ton of phone calls on the title company's part. It doesn't, I don't think I've ever had to do anything. It's just the title company deals with getting it removed from the title. You just need time. You can't figure it out the week before because your poor seller is not going to be able to sell their house until it's removed. Okay. That's another reason that prelim titles, if you are able to get one, if you have to pay $5 or $10 to get a prelim title all day, like, please do it. Here, I think it was a couple $100 for us to order one. It sounds ridiculous, but our title companies just, it's the same company that they have in Vail, but here we can't get it. And you can over there. So I've approached one of our title companies, Land Title. They promised that they would do it for 10 or 15 bucks, just like Vail was. And so I got his commitment to being able to do these prelim titles, but it's just a good idea. Last thing you need as an agent, we have so many surprises. You do not need a surprise on title. So let me see. You want to make sure the loans are right. Who to call. Easement for Florida Road. Here's some scary stories. I sold for like 14 years before I started managing, and I've been managing about 7 now. So I've seen everything. And one of them that I had particularly was my buyer bought and then had to sell a house on a pretty main thoroughfare. It's not a highway. It is a highway, Florida Road. So there's this place called Forest Groves Estates. So I know like a lot of people in my area know this. It's just a little cabiny place. It's been around since the 60s. But the house on the highway, so here you got the highway, and then the house is all the way over here. Like there's a huge slope down to the house, right? No road is ever going to go through the house. But the easement, if they ever wanted to change Florida Road, was going to go all the way here next to the house and then cut right through their barn. So my buyers were freaking out because there was an easement from the 60s that was still on it. And they wanted it removed because they said, I want that. Maybe it doesn't make any sense because there's a cliff. The highway is not going to spend the money to like get rid of the cliff and then have the road go down here just so it can go through their barn. But they were really concerned about it. And of course, the title company and the county, they're like, no, we're not removing that easement. Once someone owns an easement, they don't want to remove it. They're like, we just want to reserve the right one day if we want to do it. We're not going to remove it for your closing. So my buyers came to a certain comfort level with it. They're like, okay, what are the chances they're going to actually move the road and this house isn't worth anything? So they went ahead and bought it. And then when they sold it again, same things on the title. And the buyer was like, okay. And then they didn't say boo. They just were fine with it because they realized it wasn't going to be a problem. But those are kind of things you say easement for Florida Road. You're like, oh yeah, whatever. But if you hadn't clicked on the picture and saw where that easement actually went, I think it said it was like it is where it is now. And then they have like 300 feet to this side. And that's how we figured it out on a map. Oh my God, that's a long way. Here's another one that's come up, geologic hazards. How many people have geologic hazards in their area or know about that? I know we do. So Heather, in your neighborhood. So anything in Shenandoah area, Trappers, Shenandoah, West County, that's not in Hesperus, but like 10 to 15 miles from here, that whole section of the county, let's say like 200 homes, every single title commitment there. And then also anything that's under, let's say there was a fire and there could be a mudslide, or yeah, it's one of those areas that you could have a fire, not a fire, a flood, like a mudslide, or, you know, those beautiful cliffs with the big rocks that can just roll on your house. So, I mean, what's the chance of that happening? Once every 10,000 years, you might have one rock comes down from there, but it's still considered to the state, I guess, a geologic hazard, or the county. So for some of our areas, like I was saying, there's like a couple hundred homes that have this geologic hazard. The first time I saw that on the title is like, oh my God, geologic hazard. What is this? Like, is it some big cave under their property? And I called the county because it was a county warning. So I called, I think it was the building department, also happened to be like the Office of Emergency Management. And the guy's like, no, that whole section of the county it's called shifting soils. And what it means is that the person who builds on shifting soils has to have an extra foundation. But now everybody, that's like what code is anyway, so nobody cares. They're like, okay, yeah, it just is the way our county is. But if you get that on, just make sure you talk to your buyer about it. Like, yes, the whole area here is going to be a geologic hazard because of X. It says it right there in the title. So just, and always have phone numbers. This is who you call in case you have a question about it. And either you're not going to like to live there. I've had houses that they don't want to be where there's a floodway. Like, what if there's a horrible thunderstorm and they're sitting in their house going, God, are we going to have a flood that comes down here and demolishes our house? They might not want to live there. But for the most part, people, if you explain things like this right, they're not going to freak out. Getting things off the title, sloppy title work. I got into the business by doing large ranches, and not large ranches like millions of dollars, large ranches like $100,000 for 80 acres, because that's all it was worth at the time. So you get these ranches and you'd have all these easements all over it. So back World War II, they needed to start doing, they were doing a lot of, in the US, gas industry was coming in, and it was your patriotic duty to put these easements all over your property to help the government get gas out and carbon dioxide that helps the gas and all that. So you have these crisscrossing easements all over the property. And then when you look at the title work as a seller's agent, it looks scary, and you go, oh, nobody's going to buy this property. Look at it. Like, look at the title work. The exceptions are this long because there's crisscrosses all over it. And where would you actually build your house? Because you can't, yeah, you can drive roads on it, but not like subdivision roads. Like, you could put a driveway over it. Anyway, so when you start digging into it and say, okay, there's a ton of stuff on this title work, but then some legal descriptions are section, county, range. I'm sure you've all seen that, like it's section 9, township this, range this. So if you know how to read a section map, you can determine it with 45 minutes of your time. Maybe you pull out the plat map or do it on some sort of site online. And you're going, does this easement actually have to do with my property? So it was possible on mine. Let's say there were 20 easements that showed there, and I was able to remove a whole bunch of them because they had to do with other areas. And so when I questioned the title company and I said, why did you have all these on mine? This is for a totally different section. It's like over there. And they said, well, we just kind of look on the map and we pull anything that's in the area, because they didn't want to do their job and figure out whether that easement was actually on this, because they would have to read the title and say, oh, it's this little square here, but this easement's up here. But anyway, what it did is it allowed me to have a much cleaner title. So they will take things off the title if it actually doesn't have to do with that property. So be careful when you're reading it. If you're on the seller side, in this market, it probably doesn't matter. But when you're in a bad market, or you have a property that would be tough to sell anyway, and you get some sloppy title work, just know, just because the title people did it doesn't mean they're experts, but it doesn't mean they don't make mistakes or they're just being sloppy with their time. So that's possible too, especially as you deal with ranches. It really has to do with the bigger properties. That's when they're just like willy-nilly putting things on your title. Title objection. So I'm sure that every state has a title objection. So there's different ways to get out of the contract. And one of them is you don't like the title. This can be anything you found on the title that you are objecting to. So in our contracts, you have a right to object to the title, and then the seller has a right to try to cure it. Like, let's say I don't like this easement that shows up on the property, and the seller is able to call the title company and find out that that easement isn't even on the property. So can you just remove it from the title? That would be an example of what you could do. Or maybe there's a cloud on the title because there's something that hasn't been resolved. There was some sort of discrepancy there. That might be a title objection that the seller actually could cure. So if you have because of this whole idea of objecting to title, I really leave a whole week, 5 business days in between when you get the title and when you have an objection. That gives you enough time for you to go over the title work with your buyer. They can go to the title company the next day and ask their questions. They go, I'm not satisfied. I'm calling an attorney. They call 10 attorneys. One of them can meet them, but it's in 3 days. They still have time to sit with the attorney and decide if they want to get out of the title. What I worry about as a manager is always you being in court and the judge is there and they say, well, why didn't you just get an attorney to the buyer? And they go, well, we weren't given enough time. She just rushed us through everything. We didn't do any, because that's what happens is they know you have E&O insurance. So it's always the realtor's fault. Even if you think they're your best friends, they're still going to in court maybe say that you led them to that. So giving them a whole week and you remind them again and again, you should get an attorney. Here's a list of attorneys. I'm really kind of concerned with number 3. Just make sure you give enough time, because I just feel like if you give someone 3 days, you're basically saying, oh, we don't have time to go to an attorney. Now there's nothing wrong. So that's why I always give a week, just to be careful. And then if you have a title objection and then you decide that you're okay and you're going to go through with it, the transaction, because either the seller fixed it or your buyer decided that it's okay. So in our state, we have an objection, we have a title deadline, we have an objection deadline, and then we have a resolution deadline. So let's say it's been resolved. So what you need to do is you need to pull back that objection and withdraw it. If you don't withdraw it, it's going to automatically terminate. So just remember that. I have an objection. We're good. We're going to go through to closing. You got to withdraw it for it to go to closing. And then lastly, the last thing I wanted to impart is there are good companies and there are bad companies. In our area, we have 3 good companies. If you looked them up on Better Business Bureau, I don't know where you look up like title companies. I'm assuming it would be Better Business Bureau. I tended to always work with 2 of them because the third one was constantly losing employees and the new employee was constantly making mistakes. I tried them like 3 different times over the years and they were the ones that put the wrong lot on my title work. And I was like, oh my God, you can't do things like that. So that was my last straw. I said, never again. I'm never trusting this company again. I needed companies that I actually would tell my seller, okay, do you have somebody you like to work with? Here, it's negotiated usually by the seller, what title company you have, okay? So the teller, even in our MLS, it'll say CTS, everybody's using CTS or Land Title Guarantee or Durango Title, it'll say right there. So I'm always asking my seller when I'm on the seller side, do you have a preference to title company? They all cost about the same and the title companies in my town are really good. Like you don't have to worry about one being better than the other. And then if they say, I have no preference, say, like what I used to do is say, I have one title company that I tend to use more than the other because there is a closer there that really knows her stuff and she's a great communicator and she does a good job for me. Do you mind if I use that person? So I'm not like choosing them, but I'm telling them why I usually use this one person. But if they have a friend at one of the title companies, because it's a small town, then that's fine. Use whoever they want. But I'd warn them if it was the wrong title company that I didn't like using, I might say, I've had issues with them in the past, but if you want to use them, but I also don't want to like get in their way. If they want to use that title company, that's fine, right? Because most of the time people don't care, right? So what does it mean to have a bad title company? So let's say the market churns and you have a foreclosure that your buyer is buying and you have never heard of First Atlantic or Denver Title or some title company. You're like, well, whatever, that's their title company. You have the right to not use that company, okay? So the foreclosure, the bank that you're buying this from is getting title work they're going to give you. And you can, if you don't trust that company, you can tell your buyer, look, I don't trust that company. I did never done business with them. Then they can get their own title policy to also cover the house. Why would you ever do this? During the foreclosure crisis, there were a lot of properties being sold, and there was a change in the way the industry was working. Title companies, like they started doing it a lot cheaper than they had in the past. So all these companies started getting into the title industry, like all these little, I shouldn't say mom and pops. They weren't mom and pops. They were corporations that would pop up and they'd go bankrupt, pop up, go bankrupt. So you might have a title commitment, an insurance policy with a company that just went away, right? So if you didn't know them and you said, God, there's a lot of stuff happening in the title industry right now, I really think you should get one of our local banks to cover it. And maybe you're dealing with somebody that doesn't have a lot of money, but you're insisting, you're like, I am telling you, I don't know that company. And you don't want to have a title problem 3 years from now, where there's like some weird easement that wasn't on your title work. And you find out that the company went away and your insurance isn't worth anything anymore. Get a good company. So it might cost them an extra $800, an extra $900, but it's worth it for the peace of mind of just knowing like your title is good. So don't ever be afraid to do that if you're stuck in a weird situation. But because I don't know that I think I've had one or two where I've had the story of our title company disappeared. So it has happened locally, but it wasn't a local company. It was some Denver or other place company that was in business and doing policies down in Durango. But that's all I have for you. Questions? Anybody in a different state, tell me, Montana people, do you have, or Idaho, do you have general warranty deeds and special warranty deeds? You do. It's called the same thing. And then you got, what is it called? Yeah. Okay. So what do you people do around there? So here, it used to always be general warranty deed was just what was normal and customary. And that insures the property back into infinity when it was like first decided on. Special warranty deed is now what people do. So something in the last couple of years, it's been changing where special warranty deed is the normal one that people give away or give at closing. And the seller is only insuring it for the time that they own the property. And that's really a change. So, okay, so that is an actual difference. So just know with those kind of things with deeds, because somebody wanted me to cover that today. What's customary there, Nick?
This is stuff I remember from the class I took 6 months ago. I haven't actually worked through this myself, but that's,
I'm curious.
That sounds almost exactly like what, Shelby, you'd have to back me up on what we learned in the class, but that sounds exactly like the way it works here.
Yep.
Yeah,
I would agree.
so in Durango, you always had a general warranty and you just told your seller it's just what people do. Well, then it started changing and it was special warranty. And you're like, well, why would you tell your seller to do general if you could tell them to do special, right? So if I was on the seller side, I'd always say special. And if I was on the buyer side, I'm like, I want general. So we'd always say general. So then you have the two people that are like, well, I'm not going to close. And you're like, well, that's silly. Like, come on, this was never a big deal. And now it is. Just know that if you ever get a seller that doesn't want to do a general warranty deed and the buyer insists on it, there's extra insurance that buyer can buy to cover them for the difference of the special and the general. I don't know how much it costs. I don't think it's very much. It's like a couple $100. So don't let that ruin the deal. And don't ever say, well, that's just what people do. There's some things in contracts that you really don't want your buyer right now. If you're in this kind of market and then you're asking for like $10,000 on the inspection to fix the toilet handle or something stupid like that, you're like, oh my God, please don't do that. Like, not in this market. We are going to lose the deal, right? But there's other things that you don't want to get in the way of your buyer and seller. Like, well, okay, if it really matters to you, then let's get a general warranty deed. That's okay. But you also don't want to lose the deal over it. So if it's really important to your buyer and they don't want to buy the house, that's fine. But you say, look, like, try to find out if there's a way you can get it together without changing anyone's mind, because sometimes you're not going to change someone's mind. So don't make a mountain out of a molehill, but also don't not talk about it and tell them, this is just how we do it around here. You say, hey, this is normal and customary, but if it's really important to you, we can look into it. So that's kind of how I handled things like that. But anything else you guys have questions about?
Can't you also have them buy a extended title insurance for the buyers?
Absolutely. So on the extended, that one is, instead of about the deed, that one is about this part. Oh, wait, no, it would be exceptions. Hold on. I'm sorry. I'm making you totally dizzy. There is something that would say here. Okay, so it talks about here, endorsement 130 will be issued, which modifies 1, 2, and 3 to be issues as long as we get that improvement survey plat. So what it means is that extra endorsement, which here is $50, then it gets rid of 1, 2, and 3. So then you can get anything that just happens to not be on public records. It's all the survey matters over here, right? And then here it's all about easements. So that's like, it's almost a must. If I had a seller that said, oh, I don't want to pay that extra $50, I'd be like, I'll pay it for you, because we have to give that kind of insurance. There was one other, oh yeah, I have. So just know if you're in, let me see if I can find, this one was another one. I totally forgot to go over this, but it's only gonna take a second. So this is the other title company or title policy. This one, we just closed on this last week. This is chain of title. This is a brand new lot. Like it was just 2 years ago that it was created, but it's in a subdivision. So when it's in a subdivision, it looks real. Like, look at the legal description on this is so easy. And then on this, look how much stuff there is, right? Because that's a subdivision. So I did want to point out that when you have covenants, just know you have old covenants that came out when it first was discovered or, like platted. Then you have all these new covenants that come after it that amend it. So if your person really cares whether they can put a fence in the backyard, they should call the HOA, but they can also read this and say, okay, well, let's look at all these kind of things. And you kind of like, if it's an elderly person, I might check it and say, look, I can't tell if you can have dogs or not. It sure looks like page 6 says you can, but then over here, page 10 says something else. So you really should call the HOA. So I might kind of skim things for them, but I'm not going to be the last person to tell them, yes, you can have a horse on the property. Yes, you can have an underground fence, but this is where they go to kind of read through so they go from oldest and then they have to read the newest ones to see what was changed. If you only give someone the old covenants, it's not the same. But dude, look at that whole page. Like you'd have to look at through all of that if you really care. And what this buyer said, I said, are you okay with the title? And he said, well, this is not the kind of subdivision that you could put a pink flamingo in the yard. Like it tells you when your sign can go up for Halloween and when it can come down. There's like all these different rules, but he goes, you're not going to change it. It is what it is. So that's it. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you. Next week, what did I say next week was? Hold on. There's something really good. Surveys. Yeah, well, it's kind of tied together. So we'll do surveys next week. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Heather.
Thanks. Have a good day.